Hi, my name is Bilge Iberi, and I am a film critic and writer and editor for New York Magazine and Vulture. And I'm here today to talk to you about The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 masterpiece of horror. Perhaps the best way to start talking about The Shining is to talk about something that a lot of the film's fans will be familiar with, its initial reception. The Shining was one of the most heavily anticipated movies of its time, but it was not well received initially. Kubrick was an acclaimed director. He was, in the eyes of many, the greatest director alive at the time. But the film got a lot of vicious reviews when it opened. It did well financially, in part because Kubrick and Warner Brothers had negotiated a long stay in theaters for the film. But a lot of people considered the film to be a massive failure. And one of my favorite examples of how The Shining was received, and I want to read a little bit of it to you. It occurs in the book Conversations with Clint. It's a book-length series of interviews with Clint Eastwood from 1979 to 1983 by the writer Paul Nelson. And at one point they talk about The Shining. It has just come out and they've both kind of just seen it. And I'm going to read a couple of the exchanges to you. Starts off with Paul Nelson talking. He says, "I went to a screening of The Shining with Jay in New York. Jay knows Malcolm McDowell pretty well. Mary Steenburgen was there too. I wondered what McDowell was going to think of this since he'd worked with Kubrick in A Clockwork Orange. Half an hour into it, I was praying it was going to end pretty quick. It was just deadly to sit through. Later, I asked McDowell, what did you think? He said, that was the biggest piece of shit I've ever saw in my life. Nobody knew how to act after that. Everybody was sitting around sort of looking at their feet and wondering, whoa, was that really that bad? And now Clint Eastwood talks. I'm not going to do my Clint Eastwood impersonation, don't worry. We had the screening here within the company at Warner Brothers with everybody's invited guests, and it was awful. Unfortunately, the scary parts were not very scary. If it had been a new director, they would have bombed it right out of the building. But the fact that the man has a certain charisma going for him, a certain background going for him, I thought the critics were really quite kind to him considering. He might not have thought so, but considering. Paul responds, oh, they were. A lot of them put forth the really specious argument that he's, quote unquote, risen above the horror genre. The fact is, he was trying to make a horror movie and failed dismally. Clint. It was just a giant failure. The greatest example in the picture is that there just wasn't anything at all terrifying about it. That axe scene coming in with the axe that hits Scat Crothers, it's dead as a dick. The execs here at the studio were all called to England and he kept them there for 10 days, sitting in a hotel room, just standing around to see the movie. The reason he wouldn't show the movie is because one or two lines have to be relooped. Paul, this man does not seem to be living in the real world anymore. Clint, I guess what you're saying is absolutely true because he's not. The guy lives in a walled off kind of thing, never goes to town, he's afraid to fly, won't go anywhere, won't travel, expose himself to the world. The world has changed a lot now, Paul, so he sits and solves these non-existent technical problems that nobody gives a shit about. Where they got the idea that he was such a great film technician, it doesn't show up. It's not a particularly well-made film. And so this, this exchange, I've always found this exchange really funny, but it also reveals something interesting about the reception to the film. I mean, it wasn't just that people didn't like the film. Some people were actually wondering, God, is this Kubrick guy even a good director to begin with? Or have we just been fooled all these years? It's a fascinating way to think about the way that, the reception to movies can change over time. Today, The Shining is considered one of Kubrick's most important achievements. But there's also something else in the conversation between Paul Nelson and Clint Eastwood that I think speaks to something else about The Shining. They talk about how Kubrick is living in this walled off existence, doesn't fly, doesn't see anybody, that he's kind of, cut off from the world. Now, this isn't actually entirely true. Kubrick was often accused unjustly of this kind of being a hermit, being a recluse, never seeing anybody. Now, it's true that he didn't fly, and he was publicity shy, but if you talk to anybody who knew him, or if you talk to his family, they'll tell you he was a pretty ordinary guy who liked to do all sorts of things and liked to eat ice cream and listen to musicals and all sorts of things. I think there is a truth here in what they're talking about, in that Kubrick did understand the idea of walling yourself off from the world, not interacting with people, focusing entirely on your work. I think he understood both the appeal and the dangers within that kind of compulsive, obsessive behavior. I think he was very familiar with this concept, and I think in many ways that makes The Shining a very personal movie. Isolation is at the heart of The Shining, and I think Kubrick understood isolation very well. And even though he was accused, often unfairly, of making impersonal, cold, aloof movies, I actually think The Shining is one of his most personal films. And I think that when we look at it, when we look at some of the themes in it, when we look at why the story held such appeal to him, I think we'll find out that The Shining was, for Kubrick, one of the most important films he would ever make. I want to talk now a little bit about the adaptation of The Shining, as I think it contains some of the keys to what makes the movie unique. Kubrick always took a long time to find a story to adapt, and he always adapted from existing material. He hadn't developed his own original story since earlier in his career. Kubrick's secretary at the time tells an interesting story about how she would hear the books bouncing off the walls as he would, start various books, decided he didn't want to adapt them, and then, threw them against the wall. So she would hear this, all throughout the day, thunk, thunk, thunk. And then one day, everything was silent, and she knew that he had found something. And that book was The Shining. Stephen King at the time, this was early in his career as well, although he'd had a couple of hits, and a couple of his films had already been adapted into films, including Brian De Palma's Carrie. But King was understandably quite honored to find out that the great Stanley Kubrick wanted to adapt one of his books. And then, a couple of years later, he saw the movie and he was livid. Stephen King turned out to be one of the biggest detractors against The Shining. And this is understandable. I mean, if you read the novel of The Shining, it feels ready-made for the movies. There are scenes in it that feel like actual, entire cinematic sequences, mapped out according to, even to like editing patterns and things like that. It's almost as if he's anticipating a film version. And of course, Kubrick uses none of these things. You can understand, King's disappointment in that sense. But more importantly, Kubrick really changed the dynamic between Jack and Wendy Torrance, the husband and wife at the center of the movie. And that really got on King's nerves because, Stephen King had based this story on his own history of alcoholism. Jack's backstory was, in a sense, his own backstory. And Wendy's character was kind of a tribute to his wife. In the novel, she's not like not the way she is in the movie. She's in the novel, she's headstrong, she's independent, she confronts him, she doesn't take any crap from him. She's been thinking about leaving him. They really kind of butt heads. And it's a disturbing, complicated portrait of this marriage. And Kubrick changed a lot of that. And a lot of people were actually outraged by Shelley Duvall's performance as Wendy Torrance in the film. King himself said he found it to be, quote unquote, one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. She's basically just there to scream and be stupid. And even Diane Johnson, who was Kubrick's co-screenwriter on The Shining, she said that during the writing process, she tried to make the character a little more complicated. But then, when she finally saw the film, she described Duvall's character as, quote unquote, a moist character reduced to tears and whimpers. Now, I should say, I always had a bit of a problem with this performance too. I first saw The Shining at a very young age, at a distressingly young age. I was 9 years old. I was a latchkey kid, like a lot of kids, at the time in the 80s. And I caught it on an afternoon show on TV after I'd come home from school. My parents weren't around. But what grabbed me in the film was the idea of a father trying to kill his family, and specifically his son. To me, at that age, that seemed like the most terrifying thing I could ever imagine. And to be fair, it still is. But I never really thought about the mom. And even though I've seen the film many times over the years, Duvall's performance never quite clicked for me. I mean, even after I decided the film was, the greatest horror movie ever, I'd be like, Shelley Duvall's performance, I'm not sure it works. Her performance really didn't click for me until I saw The Shining again last year. on a huge screen at a midnight show at the Cannes Film Festival, where they had a restoration screening of the film. And I sat in the front row of this huge theater, and something strange really happens when you look into Shelley Duvall's eyes from the front row of a theater, because you really see her fear. And it's not just horror movie fear, it's the fear of an abused woman. It's fear of someone who has seen her husband's darkest side and never wants to experience it again. And you can see this throughout the film. You can see this in the scene with the pediatrician earlier in the film. Look at the way she hesitates before revealing to the doctor that Jack once accidentally dislocated Danny's shoulder during a drunken rage. The hesitation in her delivery, it's not the hesitation of an actor stumbling. It's not an awkward performance, really. It's a vision of trauma. And you get the sense that she's trying to cast it out of her mind. She's trying not to approach this memory. And when you see Shelley Duvall in that, fragile light, then Jack Nicholson's performance changes too, because, his performance has also come in for its share of criticism. A lot of people feel that he's quite over the top. But when you see his performance in relation to her, an ecosystem starts to develop, and you realize these two are already hunter and prey before the movie has even started. And they're in kind of this psychological combat. It's a subtle one, but it's there. And as the film proceeds, it will become a much more physical and even supernatural battle. And I think a lot of The Shining's elemental power comes from this fact, from the fact that Jack and Wendy Torrance are, in many ways, reenacting an extreme version of a terrifying dynamic that one sees in many families. These performances may seem simple, but they actually, I think, serve to make the film even more disturbing. And this is just one of those examples of what makes The Shining so perplexing and so fascinating at the same time. Now, if we look at the adaptation process, I think we'll see a number of things that Kubrick was fascinated by and some of the reasons why he wanted to make this movie. So for writing the screenplay, Kubrick enlisted Diane Johnson, who had written a psychological thriller called The Shadow Knows, a novel. And he had actually apparently considered filming that at one point as well. He didn't film that, but he did hire her to help write The Shining with him. And Johnson has said that she and Kubrick spent a lot of time talking about childhood and about fairy tales and about the elemental power of myths and fables. And we can see elements of these throughout The Shining. For example, the reference to the trail of breadcrumbs from Hansel and Gretel, or, little pig, let me in. All those things. Wendy Darling. Wendy Darling is the name of Wendy from Peter Pan, or even the hedge maze, right? The maze is very familiar image from myth. If you think of the labyrinth, the Minotaur inside the labyrinth. And these are all things that Kubrick would have been conversant with. They also talked a lot about the uncanny and Freud's theories around it. What is the uncanny? If I really got into any kind of detail in the uncanny, we'd be here all day. But I'll go with kind of a simpler description. But the uncanny is the idea of something that seems familiar, but also seems quite off, right? Something that we think we know, but this seems not quite right. And to give a good example of it, one of our greatest practitioners of the uncanny these days is David Lynch, right? You're walking in a pleasant suburb and you're walking on the grass and suddenly you find a severed ear. That's the uncanny. So there are lots of images of that we could mark as uncanny in The Shining. The twin girls standing at the end of a corridor, or even Danny's big wheel, a common children's toy that, when shot by Kubrick going through these ornate corridors, starts to take on a really ominous, menacing quality. Or even things like the various date stamps, which kind of occur at random points that don't seem to have any rhyme or reason. That's also uncanny if you think about it. And a lot of the surfaces of the film are quite mundane, right? They're it's set in the present day. It's one of Kubrick's few films set in the present day. The characters are seemingly ordinary, unremarkable, very modestly dressed. If you look at, for example, the interview with Ullman and Jack early in the film, the conversation, it's extremely dry, very corporate. And then suddenly Ullman reveals what happened to Grady and that the man, killed his family. these are all elements of the uncanny, where something normal and familiar suddenly turns. Or even if you think about this character of Watson, who is this second person that comes into the room when Ullman and Jack are talking. Now, conspiracy theorists and people who have, obsessive fan theories about The Shining have, had a field day with Watson, because his presence is never quite explained. He kind of randomly comes in, doesn't really say much, and he sort of looks like Jack Nicholson, right? I mean, he's kind of dressed in similar clothing. His hair is kind of similar, and the way Kubrick shoots them, he shoots symmetrically so they're doubled. It's subtle, but it's quite weird that he's there. And, that's also, I think, an example of the uncanny. Now, why is the uncanny important? Because the uncanny serves to hide darker truths, right? It's a sense that there's always a sense that it's concealing something, right? Again, David Lynch is a perfect example. You find the severed ear and you discover the dark underbelly of the small town that you're living in. Or think of the hedge maze, right? The hedge maze is, it's not in the novel. In King's novel, we have hedge creatures who come to life and kind of pursue and fight the characters. Kubrick did consider trying to create the hedge creatures for the movie, but he realized that the special effects technology wasn't there to make it in any way realistic or compelling. So he went with the hedge maze. But a maze, a labyrinth, is there to conceal something, right? There's something at the center of a labyrinth usually, and the point is you're supposed to get lost before you get there, or if you do get there, you get lost before you get out. And the labyrinth, the maze, also suggests that something is being hidden. So we should ask ourselves, what is hidden? What is being hidden here? Or maybe ask it a different way. What happened at this hotel? If you think about it, the film never really tells us, does it? The novel does. The novel goes into a lot of detail about the various gangsters and other people that came through the hotel over the years. Even the crazy old lady ghost that's in the bathtub in the movie. The novel tells us who she is, and we get the whole story. The movie doesn't have any of that. There was a scene that Kubrick shot involving a scrapbook that Jack finds that has newspaper clippings of all the terrible things that have happened at the hotel over the years. They did shoot that scene, but then they cut it out of the film. So Kubrick doesn't want us to know what's happened at the hotel, if you think about it. Then you think of that indelible image of the elevators with the waves of blood pouring out of the walls, right? It's a scary, weird image. It was used in the trailers and everything. But it also suggests something. It suggests the sense of the repressed coming out, something emerging, something that's been hidden, a great evil that is emerging. But again, what is this evil? We don't really know, and we're not really told. We're told about Grady, that's about it. And I think Kubrick clearly understands that the film will have a greater impact if we let our minds fill in the blanks. I think history has borne him out on this. I mean, The Shining is one of the most obsessed over films in the world. If any of you get a chance, some of you have probably already seen this, but there's a great documentary called Room 237, directed by Rodney Asher. The film is basically, five super fans of The Shining presenting their incredibly elaborate, obsessive theories about what the film means. And we don't actually see these people, we just hear their voices, and then we see scenes from the film that have been modified in different ways or clips from other movies, and they are used to basically illustrate these theories and all the little details that these people have isolated in the film and are convinced are proof of their theories. Some of their ideas are a little nutty. One guy is convinced that The Shining is Kubrick's mea culpa for faking the moon landing. But then a couple of their theories are actually pretty interesting. One theory has it that the film is actually about the Native American genocide. Native American imagery is all over the film with prints and tapestries and things like that. And we were told that the hotel has been built on, quote unquote, an old Indian graveyard. It's interesting because that idea manifests itself in several Stephen King novels, but not this one. there's no mention of Indian graveyard in the novel of The Shining, but Kubrick put this in the film. And we know from Diane Johnson and others that Kubrick was actually thinking a lot about the Native American genocide during this time. Another theory says that the film is about the Holocaust. And we know that Kubrick spent much of his career thinking about and researching the Holocaust, and he tried to make a film about it at various points. And remember, the Holocaust happened during Kubrick's lifetime. I mean, he was born and raised in the US, but imagine imagine being a Jewish teenager and discovering that, one ocean away, the Germans were putting people like you in ovens. I mean, that's a traumatizing thought, especially for someone like Kubrick, who was in many ways fascinated with German and Austrian culture. So some of these theories are compelling. Now, the film doesn't come out and say any of this stuff, and the film perhaps offers clues, but we're not sure if they're real clues or we're kind of imagining them. But what if The Shining is in many ways about all of these things? Because in some ways, The Shining is a great example of what I like to call earworm cinema. I assume people are familiar with what an earworm is. It's that phenomenon where a song keeps playing in your head over and over again, and you can't shake it, and it drives you crazy. Some theories about earworms, there are a lot of theories about how earworms work, but one of them, which I find very compelling, says that it happens because your brain doesn't perfectly recall the song. Something is missing or inaccurate in your recollection of the song, and so the brain plays it over and over and over again in a loop in an effort to kind of figure out the problem. Now, in film, I'm convinced that there are some movies that, while compelling, deliberately become objects of obsession because they deny us something that we would otherwise expect. So think of your average horror movie, right? I'm going to simplify a little bit, but for the first hour, you're running around being chased by a slasher or a demon or a ghost or a monster. Then somebody comes in, a psychiatrist or a priest or a town historian or some other random person, and explains what's happening. They explain what the rules are. They explain how you can defeat this menace. And that solution to that kind of mystery, I believe, is one of the pleasures of the genre, of the horror genre. The Shining does none of this, right? We see all these things. We see the elevators vomiting out blood. We see a guy in a bear suit blowing another guy. We see another dude with his head split open. We see skeletons. We see all these things. But nobody actually tells us what happened, or how these people can get away, or how they can defeat this evil. There are no rules, nothing is explained. Even at the end, Wendy and Danny get away, Jack freezes to death. We do learn that Jack has been there forever. We see the picture of the July 4th ball from 1921, and we see his face in there. But if you think about it, that actually raises more questions than it actually answers. So The Shining denies us an explanation or a resolution. Instead, it offers us vague clues, codes, uncanny images, numerical puzzles, all sorts of things that we can seize on and kind of become obsessed with. But it doesn't offer us any kind of clarity. That's earworm cinema. The idea that we've been given something and something is missing, something that we know should be there is not there. And so we become obsessed with the thing. It replays itself in our heads and it explodes in our minds. So, we might have walked out of the movie in 1980 or whenever we first saw it thinking, well, I'm not sure what I thought of that. I'm confused. It was weird. I have some questions. And then a year later, we're still thinking about it. And then maybe we watch it again and again and again. And maybe like some of us, we become obsessed with it. The earworm concept is perhaps a little fanciful, but I'm convinced that this is one of the reasons why The Shining is so good at remaining relevant over the years. And I assume some of you are about to watch or rewatch the movie, and I guess some of you have already watched it. I know that I personally always find something new in this film whenever I see it. And that's one of those things that makes it a very special movie for me. So I hope that I've explained some things. I hope that I've left you with some questions. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And I look forward to talking more about it during our Q&A. Thank you.